Okay. I am Michael Mikowski. I'm the president and CEO of JINSA. I want to welcome everybody to the Zoom today, and which is really marked an important event. One key element of JINSA's mission has been to help policymakers secure America's vital interests in the Middle East. And we believe the process represented by the Abraham Accords offers a truly historic opportunity to do that. That's why we decided to launch our Abraham Accords policy project last fall and form a task force of very distinguished retired U.S. flag officers and defense officials to examine the potential of the accords, particularly in the defense sector, and how the United States could best take advantage of them. The result is this excellent and very timely report, A Stronger and Wider Peace, a U.S. strategy for advancing the Abraham Accords. You could all find it on our website, jinsa.org, and I'd encourage everyone to download and read it. I wish to congratulate all the task force members and the staff at JINSA, led by JINSA Senior Fellow John Hanna, for all their hard work, and to all of JINSA's backers who helped make it possible. I also want to give a special thanks to the 3 ambassadors who are here today to help JINSA mark this important event. I consider them all good friends, and I really appreciate their support of JINSA's work. I'll note that Israeli Ambassador Mike Herzog just got up from Shiva following the death of his mother last week, and I want to extend publicly what I've extended privately my condolences, and to really such a superb person and an old friend. I also want to note, and I learned this morning, that it's UAE Ambassador Al Taiba's birthday today, and I think it's very notable, especially for today's event, that I learned it reading Jewish Insider. And of course, I'll remember always in 2018 at JINSA's annual dinner when we had Ambassador Al Taiba from the UAE for the first time in public, seated actually in this case on one side of me, and the then Israeli Ambassador Ron Dermer on the other side. I think it's the first time in public they appeared together in the same picture. It was, by the way, I'll note that Ambassador Dermer was obviously a key player in the Abraham Accords story, and is now a distinguished fellow in JINSA's Gamunder Center. But certainly, it's really amazing to see how things have progressed since that night. So anyway, thank you all again. And I want to again hand it over now to my good friend and colleague, John Hanna, who's really been driving this task force work. John, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike, and welcome to everyone. As Mike said, I've really been JINSA's point person for this project, along with my colleague, Jonathan Rui, supporting the task force in its deliberations and the writing of the report that's being released today. In fact, an article by Jonathan and myself has just gone up on the website of Foreign Policy, which represents our efforts to encourage President Biden to really seize the opportunity that exists to take a more robust stance in support of the accords as he enters his second year in office, and to do so by adopting some of the policy suggestions contained in our report. Obviously, I think the report really is an outstanding body of work, a very rich document that's full of important findings and helpful recommendations. And I join Mike in urging everyone to download the report from our website and give it a read. As Mike said, under his leadership, JINSA decided to establish our Abraham Accords policy project about 5 months ago, with the purpose of taking a really hard look at the accords, identifying the opportunities that they'd created to protect and advance U.S. interests in the Middle East, and to develop a set of policy recommendations that could form the foundation of a realistic but still ambitious U.S. strategy going forward to help deepen and widen the accords, and to ensure that they realize their full strategic potential. And because we're JINSA and our particular focus is on issues surrounding America's defense and national security interests, we also thought that in addition to taking a very broad look at the accords, we could also perhaps make a unique contribution when it comes to thinking about the specific opportunities that have been created to really start building in the area of defense cooperation and military to military ties between Israel and America's best Arab partners in the region. For lots of good and legitimate reasons, most of the attention over the past 16 months has been focused on the extraordinary advancements the accords have made possible on the soft power side of the equation, the unprecedented leaps forward that we've all read about in areas like trade, investment, tourism, cultural exchanges, and people-to-people engagement. Really historic stuff that has enormous capacity to improve the lives of millions of normal citizens across the Middle East. But until recently, much less time, and I think for very understandable reasons, has been spent on the more sensitive, but nevertheless important hard power side of the equation, and the historic opportunities that really exist now for the first time, I think, for the United States to help bring its very best Middle East partners together in an effective coalition that can really begin to carry more of the burden in helping to bolster the stability and security of this still very vital region of the world. This has the potential to be a genuinely new Middle East security architecture led by the United States that is grounded in this new and unprecedented reality of open Arab-Israeli cooperation that the accords have really unlocked. And the best way that we at JINSA thought we could execute on that mission was to convene this task force of 8 really distinguished retired American flag officers and defense officials who have decades and decades of experience in the Middle East to really spend a few months studying this issue in depth. The task force convened in early September. We had some initial deliberations and briefings, and then with the help and support of the ambassadors that you're about to hear from, undertook a fact-finding mission to the region in late September and early October to Bahrain, Israel, and the UAE, where we were able to speak with a very broad array of senior national security and military leaders and get their perspective on the importance of the accords to their countries and the role of the United States. We returned to Washington to process what we'd heard, had some more deliberations, and then proceeded to write this report and reach some consensus on its findings and recommendations, some of which you're going to hear about later today during our panel discussion. But first, as Mike said, to help us kick off our program marking the report's release, we're truly honored to have with us the ambassadors of the 3 countries that really were present at the creation of the accords in September 2020, and who have done so much to make possible the historic opportunities that our report is seeking to highlight. They're all great friends of JINSA, and we want to thank them in particular for all they did to support the work of this task force, especially in facilitating our mission to the region. In the short amount of time I have, I couldn't possibly do justice to their biographies and careers, but suffice it to say that they all share the common characteristic of most really great ambassadors to the United States, in that at one and the same time, they are both fierce defenders of their country's national interests, while at the same time being true friends of the United States, and I think absolute believers at their core in the critical importance to their countries and to their region of continued American strength, leadership, and engagement. I'm going to call them up one by one to just offer a few opening thoughts on their nation's view of the accords, how we're doing at what's now the 16-month mark, and the prospects going forward. First up is going to be Ambassador Yusuf Al-Taiba from the United Arab Emirates. I do first just want to join Mike in expressing, hey, happy birthday, Ambassador, but also in expressing, I want to express my solidarity with the UAE in the aftermath of Monday's shocking attack on Abu Dhabi by Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, which I think only underscores the gravity and importance of some of the broader issues that we'll be talking about today in our panel. As most of you undoubtedly know, Yusuf has represented the UAE and Washington since 2008, an extraordinary tenure. that culminated in the truly historic personal role that he played in making the Abraham Accords a reality in 2020, most visibly in the famous article he wrote in June of that year in Hebrew in the Israeli newspaper Yediot, raising the prospect for the first time in public of full normalization of relations in exchange for no annexation of parts of the West Bank. In short, without Yusuf, it's not at all clear that we'd be where we are today in terms of the Abraham Accords. Books will be written, and I think already have been written, as a matter of fact, about his absolutely pivotal and unique role in this historic process. Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you again for being here today. The floor is yours to offer a few opening thoughts.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to my two colleagues. First, let me start with Ambassador Herzog. My condolences, and I'm very sorry for your loss. I think in our part of the world, one of the biggest compliments you can give someone is to say something positive about their children. And I think in this particular case, I think your mother raised at least the two young men that I know between you and your brother. And I'm sure she's very proud of you. Very sorry for your loss. Michael, John, thank you for having us, but more importantly, thank you for this report and thank you for the visit. Bahrain is one of our oldest, longest, strongest, and most reliable friends. Israel is actually our newest and youngest friend, and both countries issued very strong, very empathetic statements of support and solidarity yesterday after the attacks on Sunday. And I wanted to thank both ambassadors for their countries and their people's position after the attacks on Sunday. Let me start a little bit talking about the attacks, because we can't really talk about the prospects and the potential for the Abraham Accords without understanding the other side of this equation. On Sunday morning, several attacks, combination of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones targeted civilian sites in the UAE. Several were intercepted, a few of them didn't, and 3 innocent civilians unfortunately lost their lives. These 3 civilians were not soldiers. They did not put on military uniforms. They were just going to work in an industrial facility. And so, as much potential as the Abraham Accords have, as the Abraham Accords describe and inspire a vision of stability, of peace, of prosperity, of respect, of tolerance and inclusion, there is still a competing vision that we have to deal with. And that vision is exactly what was articulated on Sunday. A terrorist organization attacking civilian targets in a country that is not at war. We have long left the Yemen war. We are still being a target. And just for everyone's sort of transparency here, we are asking our friends in the administration and in Congress to reinstate the Houthi terrorist designation as an FTO. I think the case speaks for itself. I think attacking civilian targets while a country is not in combat makes a very clear case. And we're working very closely with both the administration and the Hill. Let me transition over to the Abraham Accords and this wonderful study. I think we haven't begun to reach the potential. I think we are just skimming the surface. And I think the American role on the Abraham Accords, look, I think there would be no Abraham Accords without the US role. But also, the Abraham Accords cannot reach their full potential without the United States. Yes, there's certainly a lot of things we can do together bilaterally, and we are. The things that John highlighted, the trade, the investment. We are negotiating a free trade agreement right now with Israel as we speak. Hopefully, we should have it concluded in the next few months. But there's no reason the American government should not benefit from that. There's no reason the American private sector should not benefit from that. There's no reason the average American person who has never visited either the UAE or Israel does not benefit from that. And this can go well beyond just Israel, the UAE, and the US. If these Abraham Accords proceed in the way I expect them to, this will be beneficial to not just the 3 countries, but to Egypt and Jordan, to the Palestinians, to everybody that lives in the region. And I take it back to the kind of vision that inspired this, a vision of peace, a vision of stability, a vision of prosperity where everyone benefits. No one has to give up anything. No one has to argue. And so I think with the American role and with the American involvement and engagement, we have a lot more to do. They're definitely historic, and I think the part that I'm most excited about, and I think surprised me the most about the Abraham Accords, is not what we are doing together as governments, because that I expected. I expected the governments to weigh in and to kind of invest in the success of the relationship. What surprised me the most was the people-to-people part, was the non-government part. And this is why I think it's going to be incredibly successful, because this was missing from previous agreements. The warmth between Emiratis and Israelis, the visits, the exchanges, the weddings, the sports events, the concerts and film festivals, that is what is going to make this a success. Of course, there's going to be important cooperation on security and intelligence and defense. You know, yesterday, Sunday's attacks just proved why that's still a priority. But the people-to-people, the issues that are in the civilian side or the human side of these relationships are what's really going to make it successful. There's two particular findings in the report that I would like to stress. One is continued and increased US engagement. And the second would be increased cooperation on the national security, defense, and intelligence and information sharing. You know, today, Sheikh Mohammed spoke with Secretary Austin. We've passed on some urgent requests for our defense needs based on the attacks on Sunday. I think the United States is looking at this very carefully, but this is exactly what a trilateral format between the United States, Israel, and the UAE can actually accomplish. And I think this is just the beginning. I'm really excited because I believe that this can ultimately change the architecture of the region, and not just from a national security standpoint. I think really from just a human level. I think the region will look different 10 years from today if we succeed in moving the Abraham Accords in the right direction. I want to thank everybody again for coming, and I really want to thank particularly all our friends in the United States who are standing with us after Sunday's attacks, and our friends in both Israel and Bahrain as well. Thank you very much, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador Ateba, for those really thoughtful and inspiring remarks in a lot of ways. Joining us next will be Ambassador Abdullah bin Rashid Al Khalifa. Ambassador Al Khalifa was appointed in 2017 and also was an absolutely critical interlocutor for the United States in the process that led us here today, both in terms of the quiet but courageous leadership role that Bahrain played in the years leading up to the Accords in terms of its own outreach to Israel, and then in negotiating Bahrain's normalization deal with Israel itself in 2020. That point, I think, was never brought home more clearly to me and some of my task force colleagues than in late September, when the Bahraini foreign minister invited us to join him as observers in an event that saw him, the visiting Israeli foreign minister Lapid, and the US commander of the Fifth Fleet take a tour of a US warship docked in Manama, just across the Gulf from Iran, and hold a trilateral press conference with that American naval vessel as the backdrop, extolling the value of this new historic strategic partnership. It was an amazing and in many ways very moving experience, I think, for all of us, one that most of us couldn't have imagined ever happening even just a year ago. Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you for your friendship and support for JINSA, and please, the floor is yours.
John, thank you very much, and Mike as well, for the opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Ambassador Herzog, publicly, I'd like to again express my condolences for the loss of your mother. And another thing that I've realized throughout my tenure here is that one of the most difficult things to do is to speak after Ambassador Youssef. So Ambassador Youssef, happy birthday, and thank you for putting the pressure one more time. I think that since September 2020, the Abraham Accords have definitely unleashed an unprecedented momentum in the region as a whole. And if we just look at what happened during 2021. Embassies were opened, ambassadors were exchanged, presented their credentials. There were so many high-level delegations back and forth, foreign ministers and prime ministers. National airlines commenced direct flights. Over 30 MOUs were signed. A lot of them are in practice now. Numerous engagements have been made to bolster both economic prosperity and trade as a whole. We also looked at security and defense capabilities. And so I guess the message I'm trying to get across here is that actions speak louder than words. There were so many people that doubted this at the beginning, but we're seeing a lot of momentum in the days and in the months as they progressed. Again, something that was mentioned by Ambassador Ateba is that we have witnessed a growing people-to-people ties. The establishment of associations that have become a meeting ground for those of the Jewish faith living in the Gulf. There's a lot of momentum that's been created in order for space to be, the necessary space to be opened up for the open celebration of one's beliefs, whether it be religious or other. On the trade side, there were significant strides made between Bahrain and Israel and the rest of the Abraham Accords signatory countries. I mean, we went from no trade whatsoever to $4 million in trade in 1 year only, which is a significant amount looking at the size of the economy of Bahrain. But more on the regional scale, what I have seen develop is, and especially by responsible nations in the region, is a trend of de-escalation. And we all know that the first step towards a stable environment is through successful diplomatic efforts, which later lead into dialogue and continued cooperation. And so de-escalating regional tensions, combating terrorism, and looking at other aspects as well, like the mitigation of the impact of climate crisis, were always part of the discussions when it came to the Abraham Accords. What I'm trying to get across is that widening the circle of peaceful diplomacy is essential for the greater stability and mutual progress of those involved in the Accords. One thing that needs to be clear once again is that the decision by Bahrain to normalize relations with Israel was only a continuation and an acceleration of a long-standing and robust relationship between the US and Bahrain. And like what was mentioned moments ago, the US's role has and will continue to be influential as we move forward in this new venture. So we should never underestimate it, and we should never overlook it. So much so that it's not only the executive branch that we look to in continuing their support towards the Accords, but like I've said many times in the past, it's also on the burden of Congress as well to look at ways to further enhance it. And so seeing a bipartisan, bicameral congressional affairs or Congressional Abraham Accords caucus launched is exactly what was needed. An entity that aims at building on the successes of the Accords, prove bipartisan leadership and strengthen the Accords, fostering vital partnership among the signatory countries is all what we were lacking in the past couple of months. And so I think we touched upon a number of areas, but it was mentioned in your opening remarks, John. The issue that we sometimes overlook is the importance of a multifaceted relationship. We've upgraded our operational relationship, but what we're seeing today that will have a direct impact not only on the national security of Bahrain, UAE, Israel, the United States, but also other Abraham Accords nations and the region as a whole, is the talk of defense and security relations. A couple of days ago, we've seen the Minister of Interior in Bahrain speak to his counterpart in Israel. A few months back, like you mentioned, Foreign Minister Lapid visits NAVCENT at the headquarters of Fifth Fleet, along with our Foreign Minister and in the presence of the Fifth Fleet Commander. I mean, what are the odds of a JINSA task force being in Bahrain at the time? And I'm sorry, I have to break it to you, John. It wasn't organized because you were there, but you were extremely lucky. And I think you got a front row seat at how fast the development of the Accords are happening in the region as we look at ongoing challenges that we need to face together. And so in closing, gentlemen, I really thank you for organizing such a high-ranking and esteemed task force. And I do look forward to going through it and hopefully looking at ways in which we can bring some of your recommendations to fruition. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for all the wisdom you bring to these efforts and for your very kind remarks. Finally, we're going to hear from another longtime friend of JINSA, Ambassador Mike Herzog. Mike, I also want to add my own words of deep condolence on the recent passing of your mom. May her memory be a blessing. We do deeply appreciate you taking the time to be with us for a few minutes this morning on an important occasion for JINSA. Mike has only been Israel's ambassador to the United States for a few months, but his extraordinary career of service to the state of Israel, to the U.S.-Israel relationship, and to the cause of peace in the Middle East has been decades in the making. A career soldier, he retired as a brigadier general in the Israel Defense Forces and served as a top advisor to several Israeli prime ministers and defense ministers over the years, and has been involved in one way or another in Israel's peace efforts with the Arab states and Palestinians since the early 1990s. Mike, it's really a great honor to host you at the first JINSA event that you've done in your new capacity as ambassador. It means a great deal to have you with us today, and we're eager to hear your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody. I'm speaking to you from Israel, where I just ended the mourning period for my dear mother, and I want to thank all of you who expressed condolences for the loss of my mother. I also take the opportunity to wish happy birthday to my friend and colleague, Ambassador Utaiba. I want to thank JINSA for initiating the task force and this important report, and for seeking my thoughts and insights on this topic. I strongly believe that Israeli-Arab normalization in what came to be known as the Abraham Accords is a breakthrough of historical proportions. It is strategically significant. I think it holds the potential to take our region to a very different place, much better place. If you look at the Middle East, this region has been characterized by deep crisis, geopolitical crisis, and socioeconomic crisis. All we have to do is look at the last decade and what started as a so-called Arab Spring and see where it got us. Our region has been torn apart. It is characterized by numerous violent struggles and conflicts. But if you look at the big picture, I would say that this region is characterized by a struggle between two big camps: those who want to take the region backwards, those who thrive on hatred, on violence, on backwardness, and those who would like to take the region to a better place, to improve the well-being of the people, to bring about stability, to take us to a better future. Clearly, the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel belong in the second camp. Clearly, Iran, epitomizes the first camp, and we've just seen the manifestation of the attack on the UAE, and I take this opportunity to publicly express our solidarity with our new friends in the UAE. Our challenge is to deepen what we have, to break new pathways, to encircle, to expand the circle of normalization. Our challenge is for everybody to see the fruit of normalization in the region and want to join it. And I think the potential is huge. Since I arrived in the US a few weeks ago, I've been feeling it. I've been approached by many who express interest and would like to join that fold. And suffices to look at what happened since we signed our agreements with the UN Bahrain. I think it's unbelievable. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis went to the Gulf. Look at what's happening between us on a popular level as well as on the governmental level. I think it contributes to the stability of the region. It contributes to the well-being of the region. We already see the positive impact on our relations with countries with whom we've had peace for many years, but peace is now further warming up. I think it has a potential to open space also for Israeli-Palestinian relations if handled correctly. The potential is huge, and I can feel it in all my deliberations since I arrived in Washington. I define to myself as one of my core missions to work hard to deepen what we have, to expand what we have, to build new bridges. And I've been already meeting with my colleagues who are on this call and with many others, and I think we can do a lot more. And I strongly agree with my friend Ambassador Taiba that in order to reach the full potential of Israeli-Arab normalization, we need a proactive US role. It is true that the US does not attach the same priority to the Middle East as it used to, but it's still a superpower, a regional power. And I think everybody in the region would like the US to play a proactive role. Ultimately, it's win-win-win for everybody. The report of the task force, I believe, is an important contribution to the policy discussion on the Middle East, and I hope that people will read it and follow its recommendations. It is up to us to move in implementing things and bringing about more implementation, pushing it forward. As far as I'm concerned, I'm looking 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, and I believe that this can really change our region. So thank you again. And I hope that this will be a watershed in further pushing this important normalization to the fore.
Terrific. Thank you, Ambassador Herzog, and thank you to all our ambassadors again for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us. You've given us a lot of food for thought and really created a perfect context for our panel discussion to begin. Our ambassadors, you're now free to sign off, and why don't we take a minute and bring up our panelists onto the screen. Okay, let me quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get to our discussion of the report. Let me just add first, though, that we are eager to take questions from the audience on the Abraham Accord. So if you have one, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And our panel will try and get to as many of those questions as possible in the second half of their discussion. We just ask that you keep your questions as concise as possible. Our three panelists today, we're all valued members of JINSA's task force, And let me really thank them here for their tremendous contributions to the work of the task force and for being here today. First, we have Vice Admiral Kevin Donegan, a naval aviator by training, who served as the former commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command and the commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Admiral Donegan also previously served under Generals David Petraeus and James Mattis as CENTCOM's Director of Operations, overseeing the U.S. military's efforts from Afghanistan and Iraq to Syria and Yemen and everything in between. Next, we have Vice Admiral Mark Fox, also a naval aviator who was former deputy commander of CENTCOM, while our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was CENTCOM's commanding general. Admiral Fox also previously served as commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command and as the commander of the United States Fifth Fleet. Our final panelist will be an old friend, Ambassador Eric Edelman, the counselor at JINSA's Gumunder Center for Defense and Strategy, who formerly served as the United States Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, as well as the American ambassador to Turkey and Finland. And to moderate today's discussion, we are really pleased to have Jennifer Griffin with us. Jennifer is the veteran national security correspondent for Fox News, who has been covering the Pentagon on a daily basis since 2007, and really is one of Washington's most respected and knowledgeable journalists covering the U.S. military and defense issues. Previously, Jennifer also served for years as Fox's correspondent in Jerusalem, so she's also extremely well-versed in everything having to do with the Middle East. We're really lucky and excited to have her with us today to help us shed some light on this new report. As I noted, Jennifer is going to spend the first half hour or so in discussion with our panelists, and then we'll start integrating some audience questions as they come in during the remainder of the discussion. And with that, Jennifer, let me just hand things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction. And I'm just so thrilled to be part of the JINSA's Abraham Accords Policy Project and Task Force and the discussion that we have with our esteemed panelists today. As you mentioned, I served in the Middle East, based in Jerusalem, covering the Intifada from 1999 to 2007. I've been here at the Pentagon since 2007. I overlapped with Ambassador Edelman here at the Pentagon and certainly covered all things CENTCOM and NAVCENT and Fifth Fleet during my time here. I'm broadcasting to you right now from my Pentagon booth. I think looking back over the history of the Middle East and of Middle East peace attempts, you go back to 1979 and the peace treaty with Egypt, which led to a massive realignment in the Middle East. And we are again at an inflection point. This is a historic turning point, as many of our guests and ambassadors have pointed out in the last few moments. I think for me, it really was crystallized in November when I saw for the first time something I'd never imagined that I would see, and that is that Israel, Bahrain, UAE all conducted with U.S. Central Command combined naval exercises in the Red Sea. That was a turning point. And I also think that given that the Abraham Accords were negotiated and signed in the late part of 2020, many people here in Washington, many journalists, I think, missed the significance of what was happening. And so I'd like to dig into that. And I'd like to start with Ambassador Edelman and the rest of our panelists and just talk about how did we get here? What were the turning points that allowed for this major breakthrough in 2020?
Well, Jennifer, thank you. First of all, it's great to see you again, and it's great to be on this panel with my colleagues who are both distinguished senior officers who've known this region and worked in it for a long time, and are colleagues on this task force. Just from my personal vantage point, I think this has been a long time coming. When I was undersecretary, when we overlapped, back 15 years ago, I remember distinctly that when we deployed a TPY-2 radar to Israel, that very shortly after that was announced in the public, then very recently arrived Ambassador Yusuf Otaiba reached out to Mary Beth Long, the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, who's also a member of this panel, and to me, and asked whether it would be possible, in light of the strategic challenges that UAE faced from the Iranian missile threat, whether it would be possible for them to somehow in the UAE be linked in to the data feed from that radar. It was about that time that I also was in Riyadh for a meeting of the U.S.-Saudi Joint Political Military Commission, where my counterpart and host, Assistant Minister of Defense, then Assistant Minister of Defense Khalid bin Sultan, made it clear that the major strategic preoccupation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was Iran, and that was reinforced in my meeting with then King Abdullah. And a few years later, working together with Ambassador Otaiba, I went to do a series of workshops with the Emirati Ministry of Defense and War College, and was astounded that the overwhelming gravamen of the questions that I and my colleagues from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments received was about how UAE and Israel could work together more effectively, given the strategic challenge that Iran represented across the board because of its support for the Assad regime in Syria in the Syrian civil war, because of its subversion of Bahrain and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia using proxies, its support for rejectionist elements like Hamas in the Palestinian-Israeli confrontation. And so I think there was clearly a strategic shift in thinking underway that was provoked by the ongoing relentless nature of the Iranian Revolution and its aspirations in the region to have mastery of the region. And I'm sorry that it took a number of years for Americans. Sometimes we're a little slow on the uptake, we Americans, to figure that out. I think, for instance, the Obama administration tended to ignore these signs because it was so focused on coming up with a agreement with Iran to try and limit the Iranian nuclear program. And I think it became obvious as they negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that there was restiveness among the Gulf Arab states about the terms on which that agreement was reached and where it left them with the Iranian threat pretty much intact and without much real opposition from the United States. And to the enormous credit, I think, of the Trump administration, and I've been very critical, as many people on this webinar will be aware of the Trump administration. But to their credit, they did understand this shift and took steps to try and exploit it for the benefit of not only U.S. national security, but of the national security of Israel and our Arab partners. But it really took the intervention, and I'm saying this without him on the screen now, of Ambassador Otaiba to really galvanize this with the newspaper article that John cited in the opening, but also his own relentless diplomacy, to borrow a phrase from President Biden, that helped push this along. But it was only really ultimately the decision to make this a priority by the administration, as Ambassador Otaiba pointed out, that allowed it to become a reality. And Jennifer, I think you're quite right. I think in all of the understandable focus on our own electoral problems in the 2020 election, the aftermath, insurrection on January 6th, et cetera, I think the significance of this strategic shift was lost. And because in our presidential transitions, frequently there is a temptation to ignore or de-emphasize the achievements of preceding administrations. I think there was a danger that the Biden administration would not sufficiently appreciate the nature of this shift and the opportunities it offered that have been sketched out already by our predecessors on this discussion today. But I think that's why we undertook this report for JINSA, to try and make sure that there was an appreciation of this. And I'm glad to say I think there's some signs that after a very rocky 1-year shakedown cruise, the Biden administration is beginning to realize that there's some potential here to be exploited.
Let me pick up on that. Admiral Donegan, explain the significance of Israel being brought into CENTCOM. What can be done from a mill-to-mill relationship, and how significant is this shift?
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. I'll start and then toss it over to Mark Fox on this one. But I think there's a lot that can be done, and I think that the first thing to realize here is that what all the ambassadors said, what I heard all the ambassadors say was U.S. leadership is super important. It was important to get it going. It's even more important to have it reach its full potential, if I was to paraphrase what we heard them say. What they didn't say, though, is that there's a perception in the region that U.S. may be pulling back from there, right? We're refocusing, we're focused on China, clearly. But what's not happening is we're not leaving from a leadership standpoint in the Middle East. And for instance, the Fifth Fleet commander lives in Bahrain, and he runs a bunch of coalitions, which we can talk about in a minute. But what we didn't have before was Israel was not part of the CENTCOM AOR. We draw boundaries on maps when it comes to where our combatant commanders concentrate their effort. And the CENTCOM commander, specifically Israel, wasn't part of that. So perhaps it's good for Mark to jump in as the former deputy and talk a little bit about those boundaries. And then I can come back and talk about how we can take that further from the standpoint of maritime coalitions. Mark?
Thanks, Kid. I don't think that it can be stated strongly enough that the fact that Israel had been in EUCOM and has been moved now to CENTCOM is a key enabler that creates the framework now for the military-to-military interactions, for the beginning of the touch points, the growth of the muscle memory, and the opportunities for people to work together. For a lot of good reasons in the past, you'd never see General Schwarzkopf or General Petraeus or even General Mattis necessarily coming from Tel Aviv in the midst of all of the different things that were going on in the Middle East, but times have changed. And General Joe Votel, he was the previous CENTCOM commander, actually made a trip to Israel publicly. So you can see that there's been an evolution. The Israelis have always had relations with people in the region, but it's always been kind of sotto voce, kind of below the table. And this gives an opportunity now to build a framework of military-to-military cooperation, exercises, as you just talked about in the Red Sea back in November. It really opens an aperture of so many new opportunities, and it's a sea change. It is really unbelievable to see the kind of change that's taken place over the last 16, 18 months or so.
Admiral Donegan, talk a little bit more about the recent attack on UAE and how the Accords actually could create a framework for mutual defense, for air defense. What can be done now that's not being taken advantage of in terms of the Accords are just sitting there, but there are relationships that have not been leveraged between Israel, their Silicon Valley, their defense industry, and the wealth in the Gulf in terms of creating more stability and a protection, because we're seeing an increasing number of attacks by Iran, the Houthi-backed, Shia-backed militias who are swarming with drones, firing mortars, not only on US bases, but now we see on civilian facilities in the UAE. They've been doing so against Saudi Arabia. what isn't being taken advantage of right now?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And we all just saw what happened in the UAE, and we just heard Ambassador Otaiba talk about that. But if you recall, it was just back in July when we had an attack by drones on a ship at sea, right? And it was the Mercer Street that also killed 2 civilians that happened to be on that ship. And it was a drone attack, at least the UK and US attributed to a drone attack from the same, from the, orchestrated by Iran in some way. So in answer to your question, what can the Abraham Accords contribute to this? A lot, right? When you look at these complexities of what we've been doing in terms of building coalitions to go after the common good, as you will, right? We've been really good in the maritime domain of pulling together coalitions. Right now, NAVCENT has a 34 nation combined maritime force that's main focus is keeping bad things from happening to goods that are flowing on the ocean, right? And we saw there was an attack, as I mentioned, in July on that. At the same time, it's challenging to do that, right? In the maritime, it becomes even more challenging to do it when you bring in air defense. And that's what we heard today, missiles and drones and things like that, when they're brought into the fray. So tremendous opportunity here to, now that we've had some normalization between Bahrain, the UAE, and others with Israel, as we know, this is a challenge that the Israelis have faced for some time, right? Integrated missile and air defense. And they've done it and advanced the art form in terms of the technology, the R&D, what to bring to bear against those kinds of things. And if you combine the resources that the Arab nations have with that technology that the Israel can contribute, you can quickly see that the potential to enhance the defense of the region goes up immeasurably. And notice I said defense of the region. These are defensive capabilities, not offensive capabilities. So a tremendous capability to enhance maritime security with Israelis' participation, which you just mentioned. They participated in an exercise in the Red Sea not too long ago. But as this normalization continues and as technology and knowledge on how to do integration that the Israelis can bring, I think we have a great potential to enhance the defense of the entire region, not just in the maritime, but also in the air domain.
Ambassador Edelman, you were part of the Iron Dome, the production, all the R&D that went into that. What is not being taken advantage of with the Abraham Accords now in place that could do more to leverage this expertise that the Israelis have with US help to protect the Gulf states and others from what has become the new form of terrorism?
Well, as Admiral Donegan said, and as he and Admiral Fox were both aware, the United States and CENTCOM in particular has, for the better part of 15 years, been promoting the idea of shared early warning to enhance integrated air and missile defense for our partners in the Gulf. That's been a difficult nut to crack. I mean, some of it's got to do with inter-GCC relationships. What's new here, though, is what Admiral Donegan adverted to, which is there's a potential division of labor here. And the United States is, I think, uniquely situated, as I think we make clear in the report, to leverage all this. And we made an enormous investment, direct investment, in Israel's development of David Sling and Iron Dome. As Admiral Donegan was saying, the Israelis have made enormous strides in being able to discriminate between things that need to be defended against and those things that are going to either fall into the desert or fall into the water. And that reduces the cost imposition that these kinds of systems, drones, missiles, et cetera, impose, on the defender. So there's an opportunity here to have a division of labor with the financial resources that our Gulf partners can bring to bear, with Israeli expertise in things like artificial intelligence, directed energy, other new technologies, to not only bring to bear some of the capability Israel's developed in David Sling and Iron Dome, but to move forward to the next generation of capabilities that are going to be needed. I would add that that's really on the deterrence by denial side of things, denying Iran the ability to use its and through its proxies use the military technology to threaten, our partners in the region. I think there are also possibilities to impose costs on Iran by holding at risk some of their assets that they value. Although that's, I think something that will have to come further down the road in the future.
Admiral Fox, I think what's interesting in the report is how it really points to these three key moments that led to this breakthrough with the Abraham Accords: the Arab Spring, Iran's rising power, the vacuum being created as the US tried to pull out of the Middle East to retrench the perception that the US is pulling out of not just Afghanistan, but also the rest of the Middle East. What did you hear on your recent tour of the Gulf states and Israel? What surprised you from the leaders who are participating in the Abraham Accords? What do they want from the US right now?
They want US leadership. They want us, and you heard it from all three ambassadors. This is such a win-win opportunity, win-win-win, in fact, because without committing to huge military forces or resources going to the region, our leadership is unique. We're the only nation that's capable of building the framework of cooperation that has, for example, already demonstrated in all the multinational maritime forces that Admiral Donegan just talked about, and the nascent movements towards integrated air and missile defense. But this is an opportunity now for the regional partners to work together within the framework that's been created by the Abraham Accords and the movement of Israel into CENTCOM. It's a once in a generation opportunity, and we the US can maintain both influence and leadership without the investment of large military organizations of boots on the ground or even carrier strike groups necessarily. We can, without military investment per se, we can create the conditions for our partners' mutual benefit.
Admiral Donegan, see you nodding. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I think that I mentioned just briefly before, we heard two messages in our tour that was loud and clear more than any others. And the first one I covered already, and that was the U.S. leadership piece that Mark just talked about. The second one is that the ambassadors didn't mention, but it's there, and it's the perceived perception that we're leaving the region and focusing elsewhere. Now it's right for us to focus on China and such, but at the same time, if from a leadership standpoint, we're not there leading something as important as the Abraham Accords, then others are going to fill the void, and they won't fill the void with something that's going to be helpful and will be in our interests, like the Abraham Accords are. They'll fill the void, and specifically, let's talk about China. Right up front, they'll fill the void with something that's in their interest. And what was also clear is they believe, the U.S. is the partner of choice in the region, but we have to be there, and we have to take this leadership role to be that partner. So to us, we're at an inflection point in decision making. This caucus that was just formed is a great first step. Legislation is another step that can help cement the fact that to the nations there that we're not leaving, and then leading this Abraham Accords in the way we were just talking about is what they're looking for. And then I want to mention one other thing. Mark and I and the ambassador have been around through many administrations, and I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that this normalization that we're talking about, this historic event that we're talking about, has been desired by every one of the administrations since I've been the 38 years that I was in the military. So this isn't something that sits on one side or the other. This is absolutely in the interests of us, the United States, to advance the Abraham Accords and normalization of relations with Israel and bringing together some kind of integrated defense as we're talking about. and the people to people thing, all of that. Just wanted to make sure that was out there because I think it's super important. It's really underlined everything we're talking about.
Ambassador Edelman, has the Biden administration been reluctant to embrace the Abraham Accords because it was negotiated by the Trump administration? What opportunities have been lost, and what happens if the Biden administration does not move more quickly to solidify the accords? Will this window close and this historic opportunity be lost?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, there's always a reluctance when there's a transition between parties, sometimes even within parties, to acknowledge the achievements of the previous regime. And I think, to be fair to the Biden administration, they've also had a few other issues on their plate that may have diverted their attention. As I said, I'm kind of cautiously optimistic that they're taking another look at this, in particular because they want to refocus U.S. time and attention, in the Asia Pacific. And this is in some way a way that you can help limit U.S. liabilities by building up the capabilities of our partners. Although I want to make clear that I think it's important, as my colleagues have already said, to combat this notion that the U.S. is actually completely withdrawing from the region. That's going to be a sine qua non of continuing to have influence. I think the biggest missing element here has been what we describe in our report, which is the importance of having a diplomatic strategy for engaging the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is clearly the next big kind of shoe to drop, if you will, beyond UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. I mean, that's really where the center of gravity is here. And that's going to be a very serious diplomatic challenge for the administration, particularly given some of the rhetoric that it used about the kingdom when it came into office. I think there is a recognition now that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a fact that the administration has to take into account. And I hope our report will encourage them to develop a strategy for engaging the kingdom, notwithstanding the difficulties that are presented by the role of Mohammed bin Salman in the death of Jamal Khashoggi and the ongoing problems that's created for the bilateral relationship. But I think it's important to not put that to one side or forget about it, but to move forward to try and support both the effort to reform the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and bring it into this larger ambit of the Abraham Accords at the same time. And I think that's doable.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because right now the Biden administration doesn't have an ambassador to Saudi Arabia, UAE, or Qatar. That's a problem if you're going to give the impression that you're not retrenching from the Middle East. And then you have this issue, the Khashoggi issue, and how to deal with Saudi Arabia. Obviously, in your report, you say that Saudi Arabia is the prize, the next addition to the Abraham Accords. How do you get there? How do you marry up? And how does the Biden administration deal with the fact that they want to ostracize MBS for his role in the murder, the brutal murder of Khashoggi, and also know that they need Saudi Arabia in order to really complete these accords?
Well, there are two parts, I think, Jennifer, to what you just asked. One is the question of representation by the United States and a signal that we're not withdrawing from the region. There is plenty of blame to go around for this. I mean, there's been a partisan blockade against the, as you are well aware, for the confirmation of ambassadorial nominees that's been levied by Senators Cruz and Hawley because of other issues that they're concerned about. But that's not the only reason. It's also the case that the Biden administration has been slow to nominate people. I mean, we're in the midst of a major crisis in Ukraine, and there's not a nominee that's been announced for Ukraine. So this is a broader issue than just the Middle East. But as you point out, there are a number of key places, Qatar, UAE, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where we don't have an ambassador, and that has to be remedied, right away. On the question of dealing, with MBS and fallout from the Khashoggi killing. Look, I don't think we can blink it away, and as the Trump administration did, try to pretend it didn't happen, or that we don't have evidence that there was involvement by senior Saudi officials, potentially including MBS in that killing. Fact is, though, we can't move him to one side. We deal with lots of people who have, engaged in behavior we don't approve of, including, Vladimir Putin, who clearly, according to a commission in the UK, ordered the poisoning of Litvinenko in London, probably ordered it, appears to have approved the attempt to kill the Skripals, which led to the death of UK civilians, and just recently tried to use a banned chemical substance to kill Alexei Navalny. So we're engaged in diplomacy with Russia. We have to find a way to, not pretend it didn't happen, and to try and make sure it never happens again, while at the same time working on these other very crucial issues for international security. I don't think we can bury it, but I think we also have to, work beyond it.
Admirals Fox and Donegan, before we go to the questions from the audience, I just want to ask you, what are some of the simple things the Biden administration could do to help solidify the accords? What are some of the easy appointments or messages they could send to the region, a Camp David summit, for instance? And then what are the bigger long-term goals in terms of really capitalizing and keeping the momentum going? Just a few of those off the top, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, Jennifer, as the report said, there are a lot of good recommendations. It would be really useful to bring all of the players together, perhaps at Camp David, and expand. The key to building on this is the shared interests, the Venn diagrams that overlap. When we say, now, these are the places that we all agree on, and you have an opportunity now where you can now expand Venn diagram overlapping opportunities in a place with leadership and with face-to-face opportunities with leaders to now understand what's the next way ahead, the next positive step. I was very encouraged by the words that I heard from all of the ambassadors. They clearly get it. They're interested in the positive future going forward in the Middle East, and not interested in plowing back old things and going backwards. So I think that'd be one good step that the report advocates.
Hey, Jennifer, as you know, we had a focus on this report too on defense cooperation. And the first thing that I noticed, there's already been significant steps on defense cooperation, including the exercise that you mentioned. We've seen senior military leaders from Arab nations travel to Israel to observe exercises there in Israel. Again, something that we would have never thought would have happened just a few years ago. But in the report, you're going to see that we've recommended some very specific steps, as you mentioned. We talked about taking advantage, for instance, of the integration of Israel now into CENTCOM and what that can mean for these coalitions that we talked about. For example, in the maritime side, it's not. Obviously, there's a logical path now to include Israel in the combined maritime forces there. At least exchange liaison officers to start and then move forward on that. There's clearly a path to pull together integrated air and missile defense and early warning, as you heard Ambassador Edelman talk about. And then, as you mentioned in your question before, specifically, we can look at where is the research development, how do we bring Israeli technology to bear where it's needed. That's going to be a win-win for both, from an early warning from Israel's standpoint to a local missile defense capability for Arab nations. So as you'll see, if those take a time to look at the report, we've recommended some very specific steps here that also get at the question you asked Ambassador Edelman a minute ago is, that can all be part of a strategy that in different ways can include Saudi Arabia's participation. Maybe not participation where they've, right away, they're part of the accords, but they can be part of some of these initiatives and events like integrated missile defense, maritime security, because they're parts of those coalitions anyway.
And Ambassador Edelman, while I look at the questions here, the criticism of the Abraham Accords is that, of course, it basically leaves the Palestinians out. How do you reconcile that? How do you maybe fix that? And how do you avoid, as you bring these Arab Gulf states together with Israel, how do you avoid provoking Iran further and inadvertently stepping into a war in the Middle East as opposed to a strategic framework for stability?
Well, since the Palestinian-Israeli question is so easy to resolve, let me start with the second part of your question first. I think if you polled the ambassadors who were on earlier and asked them, how much more aggressive Iran might be if we quote unquote provoke them, I think they would tell you that right now, in the recent attack that Ambassador Taiba spoke about so movingly from the Houthis on Abu Dhabi, is evidence of the fact that Iran is already being, about as aggressive as it could be. It's hard to imagine that the kinds of defensive steps that Admiral Donegan and Fox and I have been talking about would provoke more of a reaction from Iran. One thing that Ambassador Taiba didn't mention, which is that the Houthi leader from Tehran just broadcast a video taking credit for the attack, which suggests that the UAE's efforts to try and reach out to Iran diplomatically to try and ease tensions may not be working out as well as they had hoped. So I really don't think there's a lot to worry about in terms of provoking Iran. Iran is engaged in a provocative series of activities around the region that are part of its larger strategy and have been since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. I don't think that's going to change. On the question of Palestinians and Israelis, I would hope that what's happened in the Abraham Accords would finally convince Palestinian leaders that the way to solve their problem is for them to sit down with Israel and solve it together. That they're not going to be saved by some larger coalition of Arab nations pressuring Israel. That's going to be the way you get a solution, with Palestinian leadership committed to a two-state solution, sitting down with Israeli leaders and working out how to live in peace together and in harmony with all of their neighbors, many of whom are now at peace with Israel and part of this larger set of agreements.
We have a good question here from Robert Danon, who says the report focuses on bringing in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but are there other opportunities out there that you see to bring other countries in the Gulf that have not made peace, Oman and other large Muslim countries like Malaysia or Indonesia? What's the next step to expand the accords? Whoever would like to take that.
Well, I'll take one swing at that. There are already, for example, some of the multinational maritime force formations. We already have, for example, Kuwait operating. So there are other regional, Oman, there are other opportunities now for our partners and friends in the region to take a look at the benefits, both from a military perspective and as well as all of the other economic and cultural and tourism and all the rest of that stuff. So I think that it's one of those if you build it, they will come kind of things. I think we don't even appreciate all of the opportunities that have now revealed themselves just in the last 16 months. So I see that it's certainly not limited to Saudi, although Saudi is certainly as we put in the report, it's the prize. It is the one that kind of drives the entire region's behavior. But the fact that Bahrain embraced this, and there's a good relationship between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, that's a kind of a tipper. That's a signal that Saudi has. when we took off out of Tel Aviv on our trip, we turned east and went across Jordan and across Saudi Arabia on our way to the Emirates. That was kind of mind blowing. It's really remarkable. So there are other people in the region that are doing things that kind of help move this forward.
Jennifer, if I could just add to what Admiral Fox said, as I think Rob, who was a former colleague of mine in government, will well appreciate. I mean, I think our report was trying to look at this in a strategic sense. And while he's absolutely right that there are other options for Gulf states like Oman, Kuwait, as Admiral Fox just noted, getting Saudi Arabia there obviously will make those others easier. And Saudi Arabia has the virtue of not only helping unlock the other Gulf states, but the broader Muslim world because of the role, as we point out in the report, that Saudi Arabia plays as the guardian of the two holy mosques in Medina and Mecca. And if you want to get Indonesia, Malaysia, other Muslim majority states to be, a outer ring, if you will, of this set of accords, Saudi Arabia is still crucial to getting there.
And yet there are worrisome reports that Saudi Arabia is now working with China to advance their ballistic missiles. So again, is there a moment, and one of the questions here from John Bottomore is how resilient are the accords? And if the Biden administration does not act swiftly, if the State Department does not move faster to capitalize on the accords, will China and Russia move in? What are the dangers? And again, a good question, how resilient are the accords?
Well, I would just say they're already there. I mean, Russia and China are already in this region. Russia, because of its intervention in the Syrian civil war in September 2015 and ongoing in cahoots with Iran, and China has an interest in economic presence in the region. And just as nature abhors a vacuum, if the United States is perceived to be leaving, others in the region will be more open to the blandishments of either China's money or Russia's military power. And it's one important reason why I think even for those who want to reorient our posture more to the Indo-Pacific, because they see the strategic competition with China as the long pole in the tent, which I agree with in the long run. It's the major strategic challenge that the United States faces going forward in the next 20 or 30 years. But the strategic competition plays out in this region as well. And it's not one that we can just abandon to our near peer adversaries in Moscow and Beijing.
We have a great question from Anton LaGuardia. What role might UAE, Bahrain play if the nuclear talks break down with Iran nuclear talks break down and Israel or the US take military action to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities? So what role might UAE, Bahrain play if those nuclear talks break down? Admiral Fox or Admiral Donegan, do you want to weigh in?
Well, it's a hypothetical, truth be told. And in my entire career, I've always avoided those kinds of questions because I don't have a good answer for you. Obviously, if or when decisive action against a military target in Iran is taken, the bets are off, and it's a difficult thing to bound the kind of problem. I mean, let's put it this way. I was in Iraq in 2007 during the explosively formed penetrator time, and we knew that the Iranians were responsible for the death of American soldiers. And even then, we were really reluctant to go into a real campaign into Iran to stop that. So I think you've got to be really judicious about the way you think about that. And we have the military capability, but it's a hypothetical that I would not go deep into personally.
Hey, Jennifer, maybe I'll take a little bit different slant on the question, but try to answer. I see the accords as something that will be supportive of negotiations with Iran as opposed to counterproductive of. And why do I say that? Much like you see in our strategy related to China, where we're pulling together coalitions, so China doesn't isolate individual countries one-on-one. They see a coalition of nations, right? In some ways, whether those be regionally or what we've done recently with the UK and Australia, in terms of submarines. In other words, when China looks out, they don't see it's more difficult for them to isolate one-on-one. We want the same view in this region for Iran. We want Iran to see that it's not Iran isolating and talking to the European Union and not the U.S. or talking to one Arab country and not the others. We want them to look out and see a common coalition that is for what the United States stands for, and that's following international norms and rules for behavior. Not doing malign activities, not killing civilians, not doing those kinds of things. So I see the Abraham Accords as another coalition where Iran looks out and sees, okay, if I'm going to do something now, it's a group that's going to come back at me, like you saw here recently with the condemnation of the attacks that were just done by the Houthis in the UAE. It wasn't just the UAE that went back and said that was wrong. It was a host of nations that went back and said it was wrong, including the United Nations.
You're right that there was a universal condemnation, but what actions were taken against the Houthis? None, as far as I can see. Ambassador Edelman, what role do you think UAE, Bahrain could play if nuclear talks break down? And I guess I would sharpen that to ask, if nuclear talks break down, do you think it is likely that the US and Israel will take military action? How close are we to such a likelihood at this point?
I think all of us would prefer to see some kind of serious negotiated restraints on Iran's nuclear program. I've already been on the record and testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that I don't think the JCPOA, as it was negotiated, actually provided those. I'm just not sure what useful purpose is served by speculating about military operational questions. As Mark said, it's really completely hypothetical. I would hope, however, as Admiral Donegan said, that the Iranians take to heart that what they're doing is actually isolating themselves, not just from Israel and the United States, but and Western Europe, but from the rest of their own region, and that if they want to be, responsible stakeholders, to borrow a phrase from another context, but in the region, they're going to have to change the way that they deal with their neighbors, and this latest episode is just one more example of that. How seriously should the UAE or any other country in the region take diplomatic efforts with Iran if they're going to allow themselves to be used as a platform for the Houthis to take credit for what they've done in the attack on Abu Dhabi. I just hope that they look at the Abraham Accords and recognize that the strategic balance in their own region is shifting against them, and they might want to rethink how they're approaching their neighbors and their nuclear program.
I want to give each of the panelists a chance for final thoughts as we end our hour, and thank you all for being with us. Final thoughts: what should the Biden administration do concretely right now to take advantage of the Abraham Accords, to expand the Accords, and what happens if they do not? Admiral Fox?
Well, I see this as a kind of a generational opportunity. This is not business as usual in the Middle East, and it's an opportunity that, in my opinion, should be seized and exploited in terms of creating the framework that we've just discussed. And I think there's opportunity for true statesmanship here. We talked about the need for American foreign policy consistency on really important things from one administration to the next. And I think that the key thing here is for wise statesman-like decisions to go forward and to look at the opportunity here and seize it and take advantage of this rare window, I think.
Admiral Donegan?
Thank you. Like always in Zoom, I was a little delayed in coming off of mute. I apologize. I agree with Mark and maybe add a little bit of emphasis to what he said. So I think in this report, you'll find that the task force did a nice job laying out some concrete steps to take, but primarily, I mean, first among those really, or not first among them, important among that is that we understand what the U.S. strategy is for these accords. Are we behind it? And if we are, then we need an approach to move forward on some of the things we recommended. In other words, we need a strategic approach where we talked a lot about defense cooperation, but that's obviously going to fit up under the strategic approach, which is advancing the Abraham Accords because it's in the U.S. interests. And we talked a lot about what these other countries can get out of it, but specifically from the United States standpoint, we have great national interests in that region, and this Abraham Accords can help us take steps to achieve some of those. So having a strategic approach that follows along the lines of some of these suggestions that we've laid out and finite recommendations, that's the way to get there. Where my fear is that we're half in, so to speak. We're not leading, and we're more just moving along forward. And to lead, we need a strategic approach, and we need somebody who's overseeing that strategic approach, and we need the support of Congress. The caucus was a great first step, and you need potential legislation from Congress that supports the Defense Department and the others and the State Department that are moving forward. That's what I see.
Ambassador Edelman, final thoughts.
Because our time is short, Jennifer, I'll be very brief. I agree with what both Mark and Kevin have said, and just to pick up on Kevin's last point, we have a very specific recommendation in the report to have the administration announce an envoy or coordinator for the Abraham Accords. Kevin, in effect, adverted to that. That, I think, would be a very important first step. Barbara Leaf, Brett McGurk, both are going to have a ton of stuff on their plate. They're going to be buried under the requirements of managing the JCPOA negotiations, the ongoing civil war in Syria, Libya, U.S. bilateral relations that are sometimes problematic with, as we pointed out, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. I mean, there's just a panic, but no one is, really right now going to have the time to just focus on how do we build on the accords per se. And unless someone has got the rose pinned on them for doing that, it's likely that it will languish. So I think that would be a really huge first step for the Biden administration to take.
I want to thank our panelists. It's been a great discussion. Thank you. The report is excellent. It's online now. John, I'll toss it back to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you to our panelists. Unbelievably rich discussion. I think you covered a huge amount of the report. Thank you for your participation, for your insights, for all your service. I'm going to take my prerogative and just close us out with the final paragraph from my article today with Jonathan Rui on the Abraham Accords and our report. And it tries to encapsulate it by saying Biden's agenda in 2022 should be clear. Embrace the accords, make them your own, strengthen U.S. partners, and advance U.S. security. Do what China and Russia could only hope to do in their wildest dreams and broker a new set of Arab-Israeli peace deals. Dramatically enhance the United States' prestige and influence on the world stage. Restore your own stature as a leading international statesman. And who knows, you might even win a Nobel Prize. And then in a very cheeky moment, we say, and bipartisan moment, we say, then you can send your thank you note to President Trump or not. but that's what I'll leave people with. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Please go and read the report. Anybody out there that wants to talk and discuss about this further, especially anybody in the policymaking community, JINSA wants to be a resource from you. We want to serve in that capacity, so please don't hesitate to approach us. Thank you again to the audience. Thank you for all of JINSA's supporters for making all of this work possible. And we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.